welcome everyone. Welcome, welcome. Come on into the room. Please share this live if you are watching on Facebook. We have a great discussion and we are happy to see everyone here. My name is Selena Hill and I'm an award-winning multimedia journalist and the deputy digital editor at Black Enterprise, as well as a proud Queens native. And today I have the privilege of moderating a discussion about the Great Migration and its impact on Queens as part of Juneteenth week here in Queens. So I'll actually start this conversation by introducing our panelists, starting with Amy Lay. She is an adjunct professor at the City University of New York, where she teaches in the areas of Black women's studies and urban studies. In addition, she is a social work editor for York College MSW program, and the founder of Embracing Empowerment Ministries, LLC, which is a nonprofit that empowers and educates young women on social, emotional, mental, and spiritual wellness. Welcome, Professor Lay. Okay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. We also have with us on the panel, Miss Sandra Lavai-Khan, who was born in Washington, D.C. and moved to New York in 1953. In 1969, she married her husband and moved to Jamaica, Queens, where they raised 3 daughters. Miss Lavai-Khan was also the owner of a daycare center called Baby University for 23 years. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for asking me. Thank you.
Absolutely. We also have Miss Marie O'Quinn, who was born in Mississippi to a family of sharecroppers. Miss O'Quinn worked on a farm where she learned to plow fields, pick cotton, and harvest vegetables. She and her husband of almost 64 years migrated to New York City in 1958, where they raised 3 sons and 1 daughter. Welcome, Miss O'Quinn.
Thank you.
We also have with us Arthur Lee Kindred, who is a licensed general broker by the New York State Department of Financial Services. He also served as the Vice President of Marketing and Management at E.G. Bowman Company on Wall Street. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And then hopefully later on, we will also be joined by our distinguished New York State Assemblywoman Alicia L. Heidman. So we will give her a few extra minutes. But as we wait, I wanted to talk more about the Great Migration. So this is actually a term that's used to describe the mass exodus of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York. Many were in search of better employment, housing, and education for their children, and less racial discrimination. However, upon arrival in the North, many found work doing menial jobs, poor housing, mediocre schools, and racial discrimination. Yet, African Americans continued to flock to these northern centers up until the 1970s, thus changing the fabric of these cities forever. Now, when migration began, 90% of all African Americans were living in the South. By the time it was over, 47% of all African Americans nationwide were living in the North and the West. So I want to start this conversation by asking, what impact did the Great Migration have on northern and western cities? And I'll open that up to the panel.
What impact?
Okay. Did anyone want to take that one in particular, or just talk about their feelings of the Great Migration?
I'll take this.
Marie is speaking, but her thing is mute. Yeah.
Oh, is she somebody on mute?
No, she's off now. Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm on now?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, we didn't have jobs in Mississippi We was working on the farm. So I came up here on a sleep-in job. We had a radio station down there, WOJT, announcing where people could come up north and sleep in. So I came up here and went out to Great Neck on a sleep-in job. My sister was already here, and I worked out there for 3 weeks. I didn't like it because the kids was too bad. So my sister came and got me. So then I went and got a job at Calvary Hospital, which was a cancer hospital. And I worked there for so many years. And after that, I started working for the state of New York. So that's where I worked for 35 years. And my husband came up later because he had to go to New Orleans to work. And I sent and got him after I made enough money to send get him. And he came up here, and we have 4 kids. Our first son was born in 1959.
Wow.
You know, Miss O'Quinn, when I hear stories like that, it reminds me of my great uncle who lived to 92 years old, and he came up from North Carolina. And it reminds me of my grandmother who was born to a family of 12, and she came up from Seneca, South Carolina, both after World War II. And they both settled in New York, you know, and before they found, they both had homes in St. Albans, Queens. When you first came up, did you have an idea of that, like the North would be this great opportunity for economic advancement and for jobs? And did you think that it would have less like racism in these cities?
I thought it would have less racism, but it didn't. Everywhere you go, there was racism. When I came up, I was focused on getting a job and making money. So when my husband came up, he got a job right away. He went to the employer office and got a job at Swift Packing Company. And he worked there for some time. So we end up buying 2 houses, and our kids all went to college, and they are all working now.
That's amazing.
Yes,
I'm sorry. Did someone want to chime in? I'm sorry.
This is
Who's
Arthur
that?
Kindred.
Yes.
I wanted to interject an affinity for Mississippi. I was born in Mississippi, in Clarksdale, Mississippi.
Clarksdale?
I was born in Clarksdale, Mississippi.
That's the Delta. Yes, I know about it.
And it's an interesting journey because my great grandparents who raised me, and I knew them, was actually ran out of the city by the Ku Klux Klansmen, and one of my great grandparents had migrated to Buffalo, New York. Subsequently, I was asked to come to Buffalo, New York, and there in Buffalo, I met uncles and aunts and cousins, and they had migrated there, obviously, to better their lives. In the Bethlehem Steel, the Republic Steel, some of the corn mill factories. After graduation, I obviously, from high school, I ended up at Shaw University down in Raleigh, North Carolina. And there I met I have a story, and quickly, I'll make this quickly. I asked her, I said, tell me where you're from. And she said she was from Jamaica. So I assumed she was from Jamaica, West Indies. And after 4 years, I said to her, I said, now that I'm getting out of school, we can go out on the beach and have a great time. I bet you can walk right out of your back door to the beach. She said, no, we have to take the A train to Far Rockaway. I had never gone to Rockaway. I'd never gone to New York. And so I said, where are you from? She said, Jamaica, New York. So I came to Jamaica, New York after a relationship on campus, and subsequently we married and had 2 children. And obviously, my involvement politically, I met Archie Spigner and Guy Brewer, and
Mm,
I met and worked for them, obviously, along the journey. And the district was totally different. There was no African Americans in party positions. Of course, Greg Meek now is the chairman of the Queens County Democratic Party, but in the middle '60s, there were no African Americans with party positions, and very few who was elected. So everything at that time in the middle '60s, the congressional district was represented by Joseph Adabo. The
mm,
state senatorial was represented by John Santucci,
that's
and
right.
obviously the city council was Walter Ward. And so we were insurgents, and eventually things have changed, and you see that. So the journey continued. There's really nothing new under the sun, because I subsequently I didn't want to go into in an elected official.
Right.
I want to be an
Okay.
ambassador,
It sounds
and
like
that's the
Mr.
reason I joined
Arthur's
the Democratic Club.
okay. Mr. Arthur, we were having a little bit of trouble hearing you at the end, but thank you so much for sharing your story of migration. So our Assemblywoman Alicia Heidman has joined us. Welcome to the conversation, Assemblywoman. She represents the neighborhoods of Laurelton, Rosedale, St. Albans, Springfield Gardens, etc. Assemblywoman, can you share your thoughts on just the impact that the Great Migration had in your district and in
Uh,
New York?
No, thank you very much, Selena, and thank you everyone for agreeing to be on this panel, and for those of you who have joined us this evening. It's not lost on me that I hold a seat that Guy R. Brewer had as the assemblyman from this area, and Arthur, had the pleasure of knowing him. And so when people look at Guy R. Brewer Boulevard, they have to know the legacy of those people who moved to Queens when there were housing covenants, where you couldn't be on the property, and where it was redlined, where realtors wouldn't show you the areas. Because when you walk through all of these beautiful homes and down Merrick Boulevard or go up Suffolk Boulevard and so forth, we weren't here for our pioneers who moved up from the South to escape the atrocities that were happening. It's really an honor to serve this community, a heavily Democratic voting base that has a hand in government. And I'll just tell you this story. Archie Spigner left a legacy, and I had the good fortune. I didn't spend as much time with him as Arthur did, but I had the good fortune to sit and listen to him tell a lot of stories. And he said when he came to New York, he was uptown in Harlem. And he said, he used the word, I'm not going to use it here, but he said, white people were mean. They were mean, and he said some other colorful things too. And if you knew Archie, you had the good fortune. But you understood what he was talking about. To come from the South to the North, where you're escaping so much, and to come here and still face racism, but differently, where you can't be certain places after dark, where you couldn't own a home. And there's a story about I can't remember. I read this article a couple years ago about a man who was a Black realtor who was able to get properties in St. Albans for Black families to move into St. Albans. And if you drive through St. Albans, you see some of the beautiful homes that are there. you know, the legacy is still very strong, which is why we have to hold on to it. They did not work this hard and suffer through so much for us to give away our properties. That's why foreclosure hit us hard, and why, as an assembly member, I fight hard for when it comes to home ownership. That even with the pandemic and when we had this recent package of money that came down, we have to sustain our homeowners. And that's why, you know, we work so hard in the 29th district to make sure our homeowners continue to be homeowners, because we understand the legacy that the Great Migration left for us to be the homeowners
Yes.
that we are now. Thank you.
Absolutely. And as I thank you, Assemblywoman, as I mentioned earlier, my family members were direct beneficiaries of that migration, owned homes in St. Albans. My grandfather, I didn't have a chance to know him, but he also was a realtor who sold homes here in St. Albans. So, Miss LaVicon, we know that you also migrated to the north. Can you share your story, like a little bit of your backstory on when and why you came up north?
Well, actually, my mother was born and raised in New Orleans, and my father came from Jamaica, West Indies, and it was actually the war that kind of brought them together. My mother was on her way from New Orleans with my great aunt to help her move to California at the time. And that was the first time she saw my dad. They wound up eventually working, well, she was working at a military hospital in California. When my dad happened to walk on the elevator, they courted in Mobile, New Orleans. They married in Florida and moved to Washington because that's where my dad was employed. He was a government employee. And it just so happened that his parents, my father's parents, who came from Jamaica, lived in Jamaica, Queens. They left Jamaica, Queens, and moved to East Elmhurst. They actually lived on 96th Street. And it was my grandfather who, walking the neighborhood, saw the house that we wound up living in on 98th Street, told my dad about it, and they agreed to move to New York so they could be near family, because my mother's family was all the way in New Orleans, and the only other family we would have would be my father's family here in New York, in Queens. So that's how we actually came to East Elmhurst, and they fell in love with it. My mother was in this house for 68 years. Actually, we came in 1953, and she was a staunch member of this community, involved in everything. And she really believed that. She taught us to be involved in every aspect of community so that we could be a part of it and keep it. You know, and she passed on that heritage. My daughter is the same. I do it in my community in Jamaica, Queens, and she absolutely loved it, and she didn't want us to leave, leave here in East Elmhurst. It's a stable community, so she was very part of it. If you were here in
Yes.
1953, then you were very a part of every piece of growth that went on. And she recalled a time just moving here. The Well, what did they say? Archie Spigner. I knew Archie Spigner too, living in Jamaica. But he said, yeah, the white people were mean. They weren't very nice.
So would you say that it
However,
met your, because I know you
it
guys loved
met,
it, but it was racial. You
it
did see some
was,
racial.
it was,
Did it meet
it
your
was,
expectations?
yeah.
Or
Well,
was
I was
it?
a child. I was a child
Mhm,
growing up, but there was a lot of racism here.
mhm.
In Queens at the time. And of course, we know the neighborhood changed over time. But when we moved here, it was basically an Italian neighborhood with a sprinkling of people. We were maybe 5 African American families on the block, maybe. The school had a sprinkling of African Americans. It was tough for kids at the time, depending. So we kind of stuck to maybe not the children, I would say, but the adults were more racially charged, I would say. The kids got along, basically until a certain age, until they were told they couldn't play with us.
Mhm.
But that happened all over, it seemed. you know. But I think as far as education, we were well educated and we all got good jobs here in the North. I think my grandparents originally moved here from Jamaica because it was a nicer community, and better.
Right.
They wanted to better themselves from where they were. And that's why they encouraged my dad to come. And I have no qualms with this community. We watched the
Okay.
park being built. We watched, we used to actually go to LaGuardia Airport and be able to stand up on the platform and watch the planes go. They were propeller planes at the time. You can't do that
Wow.
today. We have an awful lot of history, and anybody was here remembers Giant Rock. We lived on
Yes,
Giant Rock in
right.
the,
Yes.
I'm telling you, all the bike rides. We had more
Yes,
freedom than anybody that I know. This generation doesn't
Mm.
have it, you know?
I wanted to
But
touch on something, if I could, that Ms. Sandra
uh,
brought up about the connections with being able to come and the
Mhm.
children not necessarily enduring the hardships. Because I'm originally from the South. I'm from Kentucky. And so a lot of my family didn't have the opportunity to be able to migrate to the North. A lot of them stayed. And so my perspective is a little bit different. But I was just thinking about some of the conversations of what people were having about challenges and being able to migrate. I think, Selena, you mentioned that your family had 12 in their,
My
as far as
grandmother, yes.
my grandmother came from 10. And so I'm thinking
Mm.
when we were talking about the great migrations, a lot of the decisions had to be inclusive of how many were going to migrate as well. So a lot of them made decisions based off of not being able to take everybody when they're making this decision. And so just when we're thinking about great migrations and we were talking about the racial challenges that they endured, you know, a lot of them, even with the war, they would send people to come to work for them when the manufacturing industry was going on, to come and have people come and work. Because Ms. Sandra brought up the Italians, and I was thinking even about that as well. When the Immigration Act was going into place, they went and got Blacks and brought them back to work for them, even so in that case. But there were a lot of us, as far as in the South, that stayed, because there were things that they had to think about as far as their families. It was too many to be able to travel, or too many that they would have to think of to be able to actually make the migration. So for me, in my situation, I decided to migrate a little later in life. We had
Mm.
aunties and things that came as they got older, that were a part of her family, that came whether they got married to someone that was in the service or things of that nature. But something else that was a big hindrance was passing. So if they didn't
Mm.
pass, they had to
all
think
right.
about those things as well. So they came with like different hues in their families. And so some were darker and some were lighter. And so those that were lighter didn't really have to go through a lot of the challenges of being able to leave. So I just wanted to pinpoint that when she was talking about that, that was something that came to my mind.
No, thank you,
That's
Professor. I'm
interesting.
happy that you brought up those points because it's true. During the Great Migration, and again, it happened in segments. We had like, you know, during the 1920s, folks migrated. The Harlem Renaissances, that's when that emerged. Then you had, you know, massive migration after World War II, which is when my family migrated as adults, as young adults. They left the farm, and I asked my great aunt all the time, like, "Why'd you leave?" And she laughs and says, "There was nothing there. Like, why would we
Right,
stay?"
right.
Even though they had owned acres of land, they just saw so much opportunity. But we also know that Queens has a deep connection to the migration story in particular.
Mhm.
During this time, New York City's African American population increased by 1.5 million, while
Mm.
African Americans in Queens alone grew by more than 250,000 between 1910 and 1920. And during this time, a number of prominent figures settled in Queens, everyone from Louis Armstrong, Malcolm X in Northern Queens, and then in Southern Queens, you had Jackie Watt Robinson, you had Fats Waller, you had Ella Fitzgerald in South Queens, Lena Horne in, you know, enclaves like some St. Albans. Who, if someone can talk more about the connection between just Queens and the Great Migration, I guess I'll throw that one at you, Assemblywoman.
Oh, thank you. One of the things you have to remember is that when a lot of Blacks moved from the South And thank you, Sekou, for putting in the chat that they also came from the Caribbean and other parts of the city to Queens. It was because Queens was an opportunity for them to buy homes. And I think that's like, if you're living in an apartment building in Harlem and you're saving your money, Queens offered that opportunity. So that has led to today one of the biggest, I think, in the Laurelton, Rosedale, Cambria Heights, and Albans area is probably the largest area of Black home ownership in the country. And we saw that decimated during the early 2000s. But a lot of people save their money. And when you talk to people in Queens, they say, oh, their family came from Brooklyn or Harlem. They bought the houses here. A lot of my friends, even growing up, they said our families left the buildings, the apartment buildings or the projects in the city and moved to Queens. And you also have to remember that it wasn't just, it was the opportunity to have a home, but it came a lot of times in the beginning, it came with a lot of strings attached. Like if you rented to own the home, and if you missed one payment, the landlord would take it back from you. This is how a lot of white people got over on decimating Black home ownership in the early 40s, 50s, and 60s. Like you said, after World War II, a lot of families, we were redlined. Remember that? You couldn't buy the homes. So while the Irish, the Italians were able to live in apartment buildings and move out to Levittown or wherever to buy their homes, we were stuck because of redlining, which led to generations living in projects. So it was by design. It's not an accident. And I think I really wish, some of this environment, we could have a lot more history talking about why we are in the situations that we are in, a lot of us, because it's by design. It's not an accident why people are living in poverty or living in project buildings. It's because you couldn't save your money and buy a home. If you read the book of Raising in the Sun or saw the play, that's a perfect example of, the dreams that of Black folk was to buy a house. And for a lot of families, the house is the asset, your springboard to the middle class. And so we've seen a lot of what happened to the middle class when I'm not going to get into the other economics and all of that stuff. Your question was about Black migration.
But I definitely think it's necessary, Assemblywoman Hyman, because it perpetuates everything else that you're talking about. I understand that it's the main focus, but it leads to all the other things as to why we are where we are. And so those things don't occur unless we address how it started. So I agree with you in that sense of, yes, it starts with the house, but all these other things have an impact on why they are where we are. And in the sense of what you're saying, it was definitely intentional. It's still intentional. And so if we don't have the discussion, then for one, people aren't informed, but two, they also don't understand why we have to dismantle these things that are intentionally brought to bring us harm and to keep us in this perpetuated cycle.
Absolutely. One thing that I think is really interesting, because as Professor and the Assemblywoman just said, pointed out to those who were trapped in generational poverty, but then you had areas in Queens where you had a growing Black affluent middle class. And I think just that contrast is very, very interesting, where it was a number of James Brown, everyone knows, his house on Linden. And so can someone, I guess, talk about just what it felt like or what it meant to be in Queens, where so many people were oppressed and couldn't get out of the projects in Brooklyn and Harlem, but then you almost see all this prosperity in certain areas in Queens compared to others?
I like to interject. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can't see you that well, but we can hear you.
Yes. I like to go back to some of the dark parts of Queens during this period of migration, and give an example. During the community control the educational system in New York City, the Italians in Rosedale, for example, was so adamant about Blacks moving into that area, and moreover, integrating the schools. And this, we're talking in the 70s. Merrick Boulevard on the other side of across Allen Parkway, there's a new building there. They call it Queens Plaza. Actually, that building was built as a school for integration. And the Italians decided that they didn't want Blacks there, and the school never opened. So what you have there now is obviously a office building. Rosedale was a hotspot, and it continues. The police brutality. I remember
You want to play?
a young man and his father quickly was walking down New York Boulevard, now Guy Boulevard, and he was taking his son to work with him at 6 a.m. in the morning, and the police jumped out with their guns drawn and shot and killed the kid because they said he had a gun. What he had simply a car that he was trying to put in his pocket. So when I say things impacted on migration, or migration impacted on the education, on the policing, moreover, the jobs, yes, but there were some dark spots. And lastly, speaking of housing, right there in Forest Hills, there's a New York City housing complex, and where the governor's father became known by, at the time, Mayor Lindsay. He appointed him to mediate Black families getting into that complex. The occupants, they didn't want Black people to move into New York City housing. So there's a dark side and there's a good side. And obviously, we are going to have to continue to fight and continue to get oppression, get our voters out, and make sure that we continue to keep our elected officials informed and working for us.
Absolutely. I do want to say, I just acknowledge those who are leaving comments and questions in the chat. We're going to actually start answering some questions in a few more minutes. So please continue to leave your questions there and we will read them in about 5 minutes. We've been speaking a lot about the Great Migration. However, we're in a time where a lot of folks who either own homes are selling them and moving back down south, or maybe they never owned here, but they're finding opportunities to own down south, or just better opportunities down south. And that's been happening over at least the past decade. You've seen a number of reports starting around 2010, 2011, talking about how Black folks are moving back to the South. Does anyone have any thoughts on this almost reversed Great Migration? And I know, Assemblywoman, you mentioned preserving our homes and our lands here and not selling, but I see houses. I see signs on houses all the time saying we will buy your house for cash all the time in this neighborhood. So it's almost encouraging us to sell. Does anyone maybe
I will say this.
okay.
And Dr. Fully Love said this yesterday about and I know a lot of friends. I'm approaching a certain age, and a lot of friends who, this is Southeast Queens has a lot of union members. A lot of people were teachers or bus drivers or worked for the MTAs or corrections, police, and in their 50s, they're eligible for retirement. And the money doesn't go as far in New York because New York is expensive. We know New York is one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in. And so a lot of Blacks have moved to the South. And what's interesting about the move is that they're moving to red states, right? They're moving to areas where they know that, maybe, I'm not saying there's a Klan meeting down the street, but they know where they're moving to, where you can have concealed weapons, right? And you can have your guns and so forth. But what Dr. Fully Love said yesterday, and it's really resonated with me, was that they're looking for that space for Black people to live and feel that they can have these things and not have to squander it and be able to retire and live, looking for that Black paradise, so to speak, of where you see people that look like you, that are doing as well as you are, and a lot of them are moving to those places. So, and the other thing you said, which is vital, a lot of homes are selling, but who are we selling homes to? And I'll give you an example. There is a very large Jewish community. And if you know history of Laurelton, a lot of these homes in Laurelton were owned by Jews. You can tell by the way they're structured. A house just down the street, they have that symbol in the doorway. And so the Grand Rebbe is buried here. He was Maniac I'm gonna say the name wrong. He's buried in a cemetery right here. It's a Jewish cemetery, right here on 120th, 21st Avenue. And so a lot of the homes in that area are being bought up by Jewish families. And if someone's coming to you with a bag of cash saying, hey, I'm gonna give you hundreds of thousands over your asking, it's really hard for families to say no to that. So it is about preserving, but it's also saying, how do you preserve if someone's coming to you with, this bag of cash saying they'll buy your home? And so I walk in this neighborhood all the time and you can see the homes that are being bought because they're vacant for a while. And then they build the second floor and it's built out and you can see the cameras there because they're not there during the day. So they're not participating in the Southeast Queens community. It's just a property for them to be closer to their Grand Rebbe who's buried across the street. But for them, it's generational. They have pledged to this for years, generations to come, whereas we are not looking at it as the same way. And this is not to smirch them in any way. We just have to adopt the same principles of buying properties for our family to carry on. And that is what we're not doing. And that is what I think, I'm hoping it comes as the legislation I have planned to put in next year is really specific about home ownership and how do we increase home ownership. And that is, one of my plans for the next legislative session.
I think it's definitely about, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, Amy, yes.
I think it's definitely connected to agency and opportunity. I think it's really about wanting to be able to have, just in connection to what Assemblywoman Hyman is talking about, wanting to be able to have control over what you can do and not having to be managed about those things and the opportunity as well. Not that New York and Queens doesn't have opportunity, but you want to be able to have those opportunities around people that look like you and are doing the same things that you're doing. And when she's talking about leaving legacies and things of that nature, I think we have not been educated about what that means in the sense of housing and wanting to leave those things for the purpose and intent, not just for it to be left, but what does that mean for someone, not just next to you, but the generations after that? What does that mean? It's not just a house to say that I left it for someone because it's a house, but the understanding of the connection behind that. Because as I said before, in Kentucky, it's land. But it's a red state too. And so in that, because it's a red state, if I hold this piece of property, it means something different than just holding the property. So having to have those conversations and understanding what that means behind that and how valuable that is all the difference versus someone bringing you cash and you are actually watching over the home or someone living in the home and it not just being a house. So I think those things are very instrumental to families.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So we are going to start opening up the Q&A with the audience. I see a lot of great questions and comments. I want to start incorporating that into the conversation. For instance, Autumn Leslie says, is it possible to say that there is a 21st century great migration with a lot of millennials are now moving to the South? Or is it possible to say that there's a great 21st century great migration with a lot of millennials who are now moving back to the South or own property in the South? I actually want to pose that question to Ms. O'Quinn and Ms. Sandra, because you guys, you bought your home, you raised your children. Do you think your children and grandchildren, have they stayed here in
No,
Queens to preserve the legacy? Are they encouraging you to sell the house? How do they feel?
I have
Especially the
3
millennials.
children. Yeah,
Okay,
I
okay,
have
we're gonna go to
three,
Miss Sandra first,
three.
and then you,
Oh,
Miss Quinn. Okay, go
okay,
ahead, Miss Sandra.
okay. I raised my 3 daughters here and they were educated here,
I did,
uh,
I
uh,
unmuted.
college educated,
Yes, okay.
but okay,
Yes, continue, Miss Sandra, and
they
then we're gonna go
left
to Miss
and went
O'Quinn.
to, okay, they actually left and went to Maryland and Delaware, where it wasn't just the opportunity, but the opportunity to buy better homes and better communities. I mean, not that East Elmhurst isn't a wonderful community, but they're loving where they are. And these are affluent Black communities that are functioning. What the educational system is better and everything, but they're actually able to buy into it. New York is just too expensive. So I have one daughter who is here. She is in St. Albans, which we spoke about. Very, very nice neighborhood, and the children are growing up in school and everything. But the other one, I can't say enough. My daughter came here a week ago, and as she came into New York, and she said, "I can't wait to get back home," because it's almost like small town USA. And it's just a different type of community, a different type of living. And she's just loving it. She would not come back to New York. She would not come back to Queens. And I don't think the other one would either. So
Yeah.
and I've been there. I understand exactly what they're talking about. And my friends and my cousin, they've gone back to South Carolina,
Mm.
North Carolina, bought homes and are living very well without the stress that we have here in New York trying to make it. And one
Mm.
of them is actually doing it on her retirement in a lovely home with a lovely property. So it's different. I see every reason why you would want to move,
Right.
to
Yeah.
live a better existence, especially at this age. I'm of the older generation too, so it's more comfortable. It's more comfortable at this point. Now, if you had younger children, you may not want to do it because the education
Right.
system.
The
All the children
education
were
is different.
raised here and educated here in New York, and they've all done very well. I have no problem with that. Okay, but it was tough. I'll say that it was tougher doing it
Yes.
here in New York.
But,
Much much tougher.
to your thank you for that, Miss Sandra. And to your point, all of my high school friends, I went to Martin Van Buren, Queens Village. Most of my best friends have moved to Maryland. They're
There
considering
you go.
Delaware. Yeah,
Yeah,
so a lot of the
even
millennials.
in Delaware.
Yeah, so Miss O'Quinn, I wanted to get your feedback too. What do you think about, your grandchildren, great grandnieces and nephews? Are they staying here in Queens?
Most of them stay here in Queen. My son spent 21 years in his service. He went to Longview, Texas, and that's where he bought his house at. He's not coming back here and they don't want me to sell the house because they want to have somewhere to come.
Yeah.
That's very good to preserve the legacy, and that's very
Right.
nice to hear. Okay, so we're gonna go to another. Yes,
Question.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ivory.
There are some more questions in the chat box. One
Yes.
person asked when Miss Sandra was speaking, how did the Great Migration affect gender roles within marriages? So was there a shift in women being the sole provider, and what did that look like?
Phew, that was for me personally. Well, for my mother, both of my parents worked. Both my father, my mother actually worked for anybody familiar with the Boulevard Watch Company
Yeah.
on Astoria Boulevard, and she was there forever. And it was so close to home she could even walk to work. But and she I guess instilled within me as being the only other female in the family to be able to, be educated, get up and do that myself. I opted to stay home for a certain amount of time and raise my children before I took off. My occupation at that point, I was in on data processing. Before data processing, before computers were in colleges, in high schools, etc., you had to actually go to an institute to learn how to program, et cetera, et cetera. So that really became my occupation. But I opted out to stay home and raise my children because I just saw that as a necessity. I don't regret that. And I have a daughter that has opted to do that too, at least until she gets a little older, you know? Yeah.
I-
And
I'm
then I went
happy.
to,
Oh, I'm sorry.
no, I was just saying, and then I went on after that, after high school and past that, to continue my occupation until I retired. That was my option, but it was good to have that option. Yeah, you know what I mean? Mhm.
Yes.
I don't
Thank
know.
you, Miss Sandra. Um, I'm happy Cindy did pose that question because I think you said, Miss O'Quinn, that you were the sole provider and you raised money to bring your husband to Queens. And that happening, decades ago, was that odd back then, or did it create, with something like that, did something like that create any tension in the marriage, or was it okay for
It
something
was
like that?
okay. We
Okay.
both agreed to it. He knew he was coming up here. I was gonna say, he didn't stay there very long. Soon as I got somewhere to stay, I said, got it.
Okay, and everything was all good. That's a beautiful story.
Everything was
Oh.
all good. So we've been together almost 64 years now.
Mm.
Wow.
Wow.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Okay.
We do have another question. I know Assemblywoman Hyman talked a little bit about the redlining. Someone wanted to know more about how did the banks and real estate redlining impact the purchases of homes within different areas in Queens?
I know there was a point even living in Jamaica where you could not get a homeowner's loan to improve your property, and then you could actually lose it. You know, you couldn't borrow money. There was a time in there going back to probably the 70s into the 80s when it was very difficult for people. And Jamaica is prime land. When you look at certain areas, the amount of the house sitting on the amount of property that's over there, and people want it, and they got it because people could not get home owner loans at the time. Yeah, I mean that's something that I remember. Going back to when we first went, that was the late 60s into the 70s and the 80s.
Assemblywoman, did you want to chime in? Okay, you have to. Okay, thank you, Assemblywoman.
Thank you. I was raising my hand. I feel like this is the conference. So just like Sandra said, which is difficult for small businesses now, is the access to capital, the access to buy loans. Banks being able to say that, to give you a loan, and also realtors showing you properties in communities that they didn't really want to show you. And not too long ago, there was a piece on the news they did in Long Island of realtors who were steering Black families. This was a hidden camera situation. They were steering Black families to Blacker neighborhoods, maybe the Hempstead, Roosevelt, Freeport, not the areas that they went into the office to see. So when you have, and this is what's done federally, you have to remember how the I'm sorry, I can't remember the HUD, the Federal Housing Unit. I'm sorry, the name is escaping me. It was a practice of those individuals to downgrade areas, not just in Queens, but in Albany and Rochester and Syracuse and Buffalo, areas where you have predominantly Black people. They marked those areas as like high risk. So they would not develop in those areas. And then you had landlords who would, the property would turn over 10, 15 times and they wouldn't keep the property up. And if you try to move into a better neighborhood because you wanted your family to succeed, you were redlined. You could not get a loan to move into that neighborhood. And the practice still exists. And this is why when we talk about, I have a colleague, Charles Barron, who we got the reparations committee formed in the New York State Legislature. Now he passed the bill that we'll talk about. This is why we talk about reparations, because you paid into this system that produced no results for us. When it came to homes, education, transportation, all of the things that you named. And New York was one of the biggest areas of slavery. Wall Street was not our street. We all know this, what was sold on Wall Street was us. So, it's all related, right? Right, Dr. Lay, Professor Lay, it's all related. Everything,
it's all connected.
It's all connected. Everything is connected. And that's why even today, when we talk about how small businesses have suffered since COVID, Black businesses are more than suffering because it's the access to capital that we're not getting that other people are getting.
I even thought about that with the national holiday. I have to bring it up. I was glad that they made the national holiday and I thought this is great, but this is a performative action. We've been asking for you to do the work for us. It's like a rah-rah, congratulations. We celebrate that and we should. Juneteenth is something to be celebrated, but we need you all to do the things that you said you were going to do for Black people. And until you do that, we are not letting you off the hook. So that was something that I also thought, I know this is another performative action that just is what you're talking about. They do these things, but it's like in office, you're telling us that you're going to do these things for us, but you have yet to do what you said you were going to do. If you can put a holiday in action this fast, then you can put these bills in action that we've told you to do and we've asked you to do, which we shouldn't even be asking for in the first place.
I did want to highlight Andrew Jackson's comment about Corona East Elmhurst was designed for Blacks to purchase homes through Black real estate brokers, and they were steered away from Jackson Heights. He also talks about the Veterans GI Bill, how that impacted home loan issues for Black veterans. That goes back to Assemblywoman's earlier point that it was designed like this, so to keep Black people away from becoming homeowners and away from access and away from upward mobility. We do have to start to bring this conversation to a close. As we give our closing remarks, I'm glad, Professor Lay, you talked about Juneteenth, because Juneteenth is a time for celebration of Black resilience, Black joy, and just what we have endured as Black people, and we're still here. And, many segments are thriving, but many others we have to continue to put attention towards. If you could speak briefly about just, again, the connection between Juneteenth and Queens, why we have every right to be celebrating this holiday.
I would even just say that, even when we say celebration or liberation is a mindset. That's one thing. We have to think about that. We have to think about how we talk. We're not minorities. Nothing's minor about us as a people. So we have to think about how we take on terms that have been given to us. And so with Juneteenth and even talking about Queens and Harlem Renaissance and the people that have come here and the music that we're celebrating on Friday, we are people of joy. We love to dance. We love to sing. So as we celebrate ourselves, we have to think about how we have conformed ourselves to be like, okay, we are celebrating, but these are things that we still need to do. Yes, we still have things of action that we need to do, but how we look at ourselves as a people and how we think of ourselves as a people is going to challenge how we take on the action that still remains for us to do. So I'm excited to be a part of this panel. I'm excited that we're celebrating Juneteenth, and I just hope that we will continue to hold people accountable for the things that they need to do.
Assemblywoman, we'll give you the last word here. Why is it so important, in your opinion, for us as Queens residents to celebrate Juneteenth and to take part in the festivities?
Professor Lay, I think, you hit it on the head that the performative part of Juneteenth for us is great. So the festival for us was that we have this holiday, let's celebrate this holiday, but let's educate, because I think that was what it was lacking. So Saida, I don't know if she's on the Zoom, but she's when as the holiday, signed into law, and being that it's not lost on me how my name is on the legislation, but I carry all the blood and trauma and love of my ancestors to get to this point. So I wanted it to be a celebration for us, but I also wanted to be an education for us. And Saida came up with the idea of doing these Zooms each day prior to Juneteenth. And on the Monday night Zoom, we said we should do a teach-in. And I think for me, it was like, now that our children have this day off, and our adults, because a lot of our adults need education too. Juneteenth is going to be a conversation or a gateway to talk about us, our liberation, what we have done, how far we've come, how much we took on that they tried to kill us. And Dr. Fully Love and Sekou have said this, like we have been through everything. There were so many different types of slaves that they brought here, and we survived. And look how far we've come since from Juneteenth 1865 to now, and look how much further we have to go. So it is celebratory, but for me, it's more about the education of our children to know there's more than, we weren't slaves, we're enslaved people. And look what we've done, and look how much more we have to do.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I want to thank all of the amazing panelists today, Ms. O'Quinn, Professor Lay, Mr. Kindred, Ms. Sandra, Assemblywoman. Thank you so much for the insight and that you shared today. We had a strong conversation and a very inspiring conversation. I want to thank you. Also want to thank Tanisha and everyone else on the team that put this together. This was a wonderful conversation. And remember, you can join the Juneteenth celebration this Saturday at Roy Wilkins Park. That's Saturday, June 19th. I think everything starts around 11 a.m. There will also be more Zoom conversations like this tomorrow, Thursday at 6 p.m. You can use the same Zoom link to join us here on Thursday. And then again on Friday, the conversation will be Songs of Freedom. So let's continue to unify and do all of this in the spirit of Juneteenth. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Listen to the music, yo.